It was a bright and early Monday morning when John Matthews, the CEO of a multi-million-dollar tech company, walked into the lobby of his headquarters. He was dressed sharply in a tailored black suit, his presence commanding respect. He had been in countless meetings with clients, investors, and high-level executives, but today it felt different. There was a certain tension in the air, an unspoken feeling that something wasn't quite right. But John brushed it off, confident in his leadership and the strength of his company. As he approached the reception desk, he noticed the receptionist. Her name was Kelly, a young woman in her mid-20s. She was typing away at her computer, completely absorbed in her work. John had never seen her before, but that was not unusual. He often didn't pay attention to the names of people who worked the front desk. After all, there were dozens of employees in the building. Still, as he approached, something felt different about the situation. John stood there for a moment, waiting for her to acknowledge his presence, but she didn't look up. He cleared his throat, a gentle but clear signal of his presence. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm and collected as always. "I'm John Matthews, the CEO. I need to speak with the Director of Operations." Kelly glanced up at him, her expression unreadable. For a brief second, John thought she might recognize him, but instead, her face tightened with indifference. Without a hint of acknowledgement, she casually replied, "You need to wait in line. I'll get to you when I can." John was taken aback. His first instinct was to laugh, but something in her tone made him pause. There was no respect in her voice, no recognition of the authority he held. He had been in situations where employees didn't immediately recognize him, but this level of rudeness was unheard of. His position, his reputation, and his leadership had earned him respect wherever he went. This woman, however, wasn't even looking at him with the courtesy of a basic acknowledgement. John's eyebrows furrowed. He gave her a moment to continue, expecting that this was a mistake, perhaps an offhand comment or a misunderstanding. But she didn't say anything more. She simply went back to typing, almost as if he were invisible. "Excuse me, miss," John said, his voice still calm but now tinged with confusion. "I think there's been a mistake. I'm the CEO. I'm not here as a regular visitor. Please check again." Kelly looked up slowly, but instead of showing any recognition or apology, her lips curled into a sneer. "I don't care who you are," she said, her tone now sharp. "You're not on the list. You don't belong here. Get lost, ape." The words hit John like a cold slap in the face. Get lost, ape. He couldn't believe it. He had been disrespected in many ways throughout his career, but never like this. Never in such a blatant, dehumanizing manner. For a split second, he stood there, stunned. His mind raced. He was a man who prided himself on his ability to stay composed, no matter the situation. But this was different. His jaw clenched, and his hands instinctively balled into fists. He had built this company from the ground up, sacrificing countless hours, earning every bit of respect he had in the business world. And now, this young receptionist, who didn't even know who he was, had the audacity to speak to him this way. The room seemed to grow colder as the silence stretched on. The other employees in the lobby were starting to notice the tension between the two. John's mind raced. Was this an isolated incident? Was it a test of some kind? Or was this the kind of culture his company had become? John knew that how he reacted in this moment would define his leadership. He had to make a decision, and he had to make it quickly. Would he take the high road and ignore the insult, or would he show this woman the consequences of disrespecting him in such a public way? The pressure of the moment weighed heavily on him. He had built a reputation on being calm under pressure, but now, this wasn't just about him. It was about the culture of the company he had worked so hard to build. The decision came quickly. John Matthews wasn't the kind of man to let disrespect slide. Not this time. Not when it had crossed a line so publicly. He took a deep breath and, without saying another word, turned on his heel and walked towards the elevator. The doors closed behind him with a quiet beep, leaving Kelly standing behind the desk, still staring at the screen in front of her. But John's mind wasn't on her anymore. He was already thinking of what he would do next, and it would be something none of them would ever forget. John Matthews stood in the elevator, his mind racing with the events that had just unfolded. The elevator doors slid shut with a soft whoosh, leaving him in the quiet solitude of the descending lift. He stared at his reflection in the polished metal, the harsh words from the receptionist echoing in his ears. "Get lost, ape." The words seemed to reverberate louder with each passing second, growing in intensity. He had never been disrespected so openly before. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. But at the same time, there was something else stirring within him, something deeper than just anger. It was a feeling of betrayal, of disgust at how a single moment of disrespect had the potential to undo everything he had worked for. As the elevator descended, John closed his eyes, trying to steady his thoughts. The weight of the situation was heavy, and he knew he needed to act fast. His usual response to any problem had been calmness and diplomacy, but this wasn't just a minor setback. This wasn't just about a single person's rude comment, it was about the entire culture of the company he had built. His mind flashed to the thousands of employees he managed, the clients, the partners, and the investors. He had always prided himself on creating a respectful and productive work environment, one where everyone felt valued and acknowledged. But what had just happened at the front desk shattered that illusion. The elevator dinged as it reached the ground floor, and John stepped out into the lobby. The moment he exited the elevator, he was met with the sight of his personal assistant, Sarah, waiting for him. She smiled as she approached, but the expression on John's face was enough to make her stop mid-step. She had seen him frustrated before, but never like this. Something in his demeanor made her instantly aware that this wasn't a typical day. "Is everything okay, Mr. Matthews?" Sarah asked, her voice tentative. She had worked with him for years and knew when something was off. John's jaw tightened as he looked at her, his gaze sharp. "No, Sarah, everything is not okay." The moment the words left his mouth, he knew he had made up his mind. The decision that had been brewing in his mind for the past few minutes was now set. He turned away from Sarah and walked toward his office, his footsteps purposeful and heavy. He didn't look back to see if she was following, because he knew she was. But this was something he had to do on his own. He needed to make it clear that respect wasn't just something he demanded from others. It was something that had to be earned across every level of his company. John stepped into his office, closing the door behind him with a deliberate force. The sound of the door clicking shut felt like the finality of his decision. He stood still for a moment, his eyes scanning the room. The sleek furniture, the glass walls, the view of the city, it all seemed so distant now. This was his empire, built with sweat and sacrifice. And now, it was being tested in the most unexpected way. He pulled out his phone from his pocket, his fingers shaking slightly as he unlocked the screen. He quickly scrolled through his contacts and stopped at the name he was looking for, David Harris, the COO. John hit the call button and waited as the phone rang. His pulse quickened as he waited for David to pick up. The call went through, and David's voice greeted him on the other end. "John, what's up? I need you to gather the senior management team immediately," John said, his voice steady but filled with an underlying urgency. "I need to speak with all of them right now." There was a brief pause, and then David responded, "Okay, I'll get them together. What's going on?" "You'll find out soon enough," John replied, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. With that, he ended the call and turned to face the large glass window in his office. He could see the city stretching out before him, a sprawling landscape of opportunity. But in that moment, it felt like a prison. The company he had spent years building was at a crossroads, and it was time to make a choice that would shake it to its core. John sat down at his desk, his mind racing through the implications of what he was about to do. He had worked tirelessly to build a company known for its innovation, its professionalism, and its integrity. But one instance of disrespect, one moment of disregard for his authority, had sent everything into question. He knew that how he responded to this would set the tone for the future of the company. He couldn't afford to let this slide. Without hesitation, he drafted an email to the entire staff, outlining his decision. Effective immediately, the company is shutting down operations for the day. All departments are to cease work. I will address the entire staff later this afternoon. He hesitated for just a moment before pressing send. The decision was made, and there was no going back. As John leaned back in his chair, his heart raced. The shock of the decision was still settling in, but he knew deep down that this was what had to be done. It wasn't about revenge. It was about sending a message that respect was non-negotiable, and anyone who thought otherwise would have to face the consequences. The company would never be the same after today. But if it meant rebuilding on a foundation of respect and integrity, then it was a price he was willing to pay. The true test was just beginning, and John Matthews was ready to face it head-on. The minutes following John Matthews' decision were the most tense the company had ever witnessed. As soon as the email went out, the ripple effects were immediate. Employees stopped working, meetings were interrupted, and a sense of confusion swept through the office like a storm. It was as though the very fabric of the company had been torn apart in an instant. No one could quite understand what had just happened. Why had John, the CEO, made such a drastic decision over something as seemingly trivial as an interaction with a receptionist? The email was simple. Effective immediately. All operations are to cease for the day. Please await further instructions. A company-wide meeting will be held at 2 p.m. Regards, John Matthews. That was it. No explanation. No details. Just a clear order to stop everything. As employees checked their phones and computers, whispers started to spread like wildfire. What had led to this moment? Why was the CEO taking such a drastic step? As the clock ticked closer to 2 p.m., the tension in the air grew thicker. The employees gathered in the conference room, their faces filled with confusion and curiosity. No one knew exactly what to expect. Many had worked for the company for years, and they had never seen anything like this. The meeting room buzzed with nervous energy, but no one dared to speak. Everyone was waiting for John. At exactly 2 p.m., John entered the room, his presence commanding the silence of the room. He walked to the front, standing tall, his face unreadable. The room felt colder as the door shut behind him. He didn't start by offering a warm greeting. Instead, he paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the faces of the employees in front of him. This company was built on respect, John began, his voice steady but firm. Respect for each other, for our clients, for our work. And that respect, the very foundation of this company, was shattered this morning. I don't care if it came from a receptionist, a janitor, or an executive. The lack of respect shown to me, and to all of you, is something that cannot and will not be tolerated. A murmur of surprise ran through the room. No one had expected such an intense opening. Some looked uncomfortable, others were completely still, their eyes fixed on John. But no one interrupted. I was told to get lost by a receptionist this morning, John continued, his voice growing colder with every word. And yes, I could have let it slide. I could have brushed it off as an isolated incident, a mistake. But I didn't, because this is bigger than one person. This is about the culture of this company. This is about the values we uphold every single day. If we allow this type of behavior to go unchecked, we are no better than the person who disrespected me this morning, and I will not allow that to happen. John paused again, his eyes locking with the room. So, I made a decision. The company is shut down for today, and no one will leave until we have a conversation about respect. This is your warning. If you cannot respect the people you work with, the company you represent, then maybe this company is not the right place for you. A tense silence followed. The weight of John's words hung heavily in the air. Some employees shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others exchanged glances. But no one dared to speak. John's reputation preceded him. Everyone knew that when John Matthews made a decision, it was final. And now, it seemed, the consequences of that decision were far-reaching. As the minutes passed, John's words sank in. It wasn't just the receptionist who had crossed a line. This was a wake-up call for everyone in the company. If the CEO was willing to take such drastic action over a single moment of disrespect, then perhaps it was time to examine the company's culture more closely. Were there others who had been allowing disrespect to go unchecked? Was this a sign of something deeper within the organization? The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Media outlets caught wind of the story, and soon, the company found itself at the center of public scrutiny. What started as an isolated incident had quickly become a public spectacle. Headlines began to appear. CEO shuts down company over disrespectful receptionist. CEO's bold move sparks controversy in business world. And how one moment of disrespect cost a company everything. The company's social media pages were flooded with comments, some supportive, others critical, but all of them asking the same question. What kind of CEO would shut down an entire company over a receptionist's insult? Clients began to ask questions. Contracts were put on hold as the business world watched closely to see how John Matthews would handle the fallout. Investors began to feel nervous. Was this a sign of instability at the top? Could they trust the leadership of a man who would make such an extreme decision? Inside the company, the employees who had once seen John as a steady, unflappable leader were now questioning everything. Could they rely on him to guide them through challenges in the future? What did his decisions say about the company's priorities? Was this a momentary lapse in judgment, or was this the beginning of a new, more authoritarian approach to leadership? In the following days, John met with his senior team to discuss how to manage the fallout. He was determined to rebuild the company's culture from the ground up, starting with respect. But the damage had been done. The consequences of his decision had already rippled through the business world, and no one knew exactly how it would all play out. John's shocking decision had sent a clear message. Respect was non-negotiable. But the real question now was whether that message had been understood, and whether the company could recover from the chaos it had caused. Only time would tell. The days that followed John Matthews' shocking decision to shut down operations were a whirlwind of meetings, media interviews, and difficult conversations. The company's future was hanging in the balance, and the scrutiny from the outside world seemed relentless. Investors, clients, and employees were all questioning the stability of the leadership, wondering if John's actions had been a momentary lapse in judgment or if they represented a deeper shift in the company's direction. Inside the company, however, the tension was beginning to ease, albeit slowly. The initial shock had worn off, and people were beginning to reflect on the meaning behind John's decision. They had felt the weight of his words in that fateful meeting. Words about respect, about values, about the kind of company they were building. What had seemed like a harsh and extreme move at first was now starting to take on new meaning. John knew that the real work was only just beginning. While the media buzzed about his decision, he focused on restoring the internal balance. The company had been shaken, but it wasn't broken. And as a leader, it was his responsibility to pick up the pieces and steer them in the right direction. He had to prove to everyone, including himself, that his actions had a purpose, that his message about respect was not just words, but a call to action. John began by holding individual meetings with key leaders in the company. He sat down with each of his senior managers and listened to their concerns, their thoughts, and their frustrations. He knew that the company could not move forward unless he understood the full scope of the impact his decision had made on the people he relied on the most. At first, many of the managers were hesitant. They had seen John as a leader who never showed weakness, someone who led with a calm, composed demeanor. But now, they saw a different side of him, a leader who was willing to take responsibility for his actions and willing to listen. This shift in his approach slowly began to rebuild trust within the company's leadership team. After a few days, John called another company-wide meeting. This time, the atmosphere was different. There was no shock, no confusion. People knew what to expect. But what they didn't know was that John was about to deliver a message that would reshape the company's culture forever. The employees filled the conference room, and the energy was noticeably more subdued than it had been before. John walked to the front of the room and paused for a moment, scanning the faces of the employees. He had seen the tension in their eyes, the uncertainty about their futures. It was time to restore that certainty. "I know many of you have been wondering if the decision I made was the right one," John began, his voice steady. "And I know that it has caused a great deal of confusion and stress. But I'm here to tell you that it was the right decision, not because of the receptionist, not because of me, but because of all of us." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. "This company is more than just a business. It's a family. And like any family, we need to have mutual respect. If we lose that, we lose everything. I shut down this company because I was disrespected, yes, but it wasn't just about me. It was about all of you. It was about ensuring that we have a culture where everyone, no matter their position, no matter their title, feels valued and respected." John's words hung in the air, and for the first time in days, the room was completely silent. The employees were absorbing what he was saying, reflecting on the reality of what had just happened. The culture he had created was one of high expectations, but also of high respect. It was a place where everyone mattered, where no one should be made to feel small or insignificant. "I understand that my actions may have been extreme," John continued, his voice softer now, but still firm. "But sometimes you have to shake things up to make a point. And this was my point. We will not tolerate disrespect. Not in the halls, not in meetings, not in the work we do. We are all in this together. And I will fight for each and every one of you, as long as you're willing to fight for each other." As John spoke, a wave of realization washed over the employees. The shock of the past few days had given way to a deep sense of understanding. They saw now that John's decision had been a wake-up call, a call to action that went beyond a single moment of rudeness. It was a call to embrace a culture of mutual respect, to hold each other accountable, and to work together toward a common goal. The employees, many of whom had been skeptical at first, now felt a renewed sense of purpose. They understood that John's actions, while drastic, had been driven by a deep belief in the company's core values. It wasn't about being authoritarian. It was about creating an environment where everyone could thrive, where no one's voice was overlooked, and where every individual's contribution was acknowledged. By the end of the meeting, the atmosphere had completely changed. There was a sense of unity, a shared understanding that had not been there before. The company was no longer just a place to work. It was a place to grow, to learn, and to be respected. John Matthews had not only restored the company's reputation, but he had also instilled in everyone the importance of their collective values. The media had begun to take a different view of the situation as well. What had once been painted as a moment of corporate instability was now seen as a bold move that showed the true strength of the company's leadership. The story of the CEO's extreme decision had taken on new meaning, becoming a powerful symbol of the company's commitment to respect and integrity. As the employees left the conference room that day, there was a palpable sense of optimism in the air. John had shown them that leadership wasn't just about making tough decisions. It was about making decisions that reflected the values of the company, even when those decisions were difficult. And in that moment, the company was stronger than it had ever been before.